Okay, cool. So this afternoon we're going to talk about Angular directives. I'm going to try to get you guys to lab time as soon as I can so we can start practicing this stuff. I just put into Slack the lesson plan for this afternoon. And I also put in, if you see that last link, I went ahead and deployed, as we saw, that's a pretty involved process, to BitBalloon, just a quick example of what we're going to build this afternoon before lab. So let me share my screen and quickly touch on some of the high points of this beautiful application. So as you guessed, we're going to build a to-do app, which kind of is the, I guess that's the old standby for kind of your intro to any language or framework type situation. So this app actually does a lot of cool things, although it doesn't look very fancy. The first thing it does is it uses ng model. It uses some data binding, and it's actually real-time data binding. So if you take a look at the app, if I want to put in like drink some beer, this is kind of jQuery-esque in that with each, this is very much data and event-driven. So every time I have a keystroke here within my janky little form, it actually in real time will update my DOM, which is pretty cool. And then when I hit enter, the form is cleared out and my new to-do is added to the bottom of the list. I'm also keeping count of my to-dos right here. You have this many to-dos and such. And then if I refresh, all of that data disappears. So I have some hard-coded data. These are 5 to-dos that are hard-coded in our controller, and we're going to hard-code those here shortly. Let me ask you guys a question. When we were playing around with Heroku yesterday, or your deployed apps, if I went onto one of your Heroku apps and created a new user or something, that information would persist. But if you guys go to this Angular app, the link that I just put into Slack, do you guys see this information that I'm adding? Do you see my to-dos that I'm putting into the browser? Do you guys happen to see that? Walk through this lesson. So is anyone seeing my to-dos locally on their machine? Okay, so you shouldn't, actually. If you are, please let me know, because that new Sierra operating system is screwing up. So here's the question. Why aren't you seeing my information? Whereas yesterday with our Project 2s, we were able to, add, create, do CRUD on each other's Heroku apps. We were all able to see that information. So Zarella's on the right track. Because is local. Because local. But can you go into a little bit more detail? There was a database linked. Okay. Closer. Can someone expand on that? Not the case now. Okay. Do I even have like a Node or Express server running for this app? I mean, I'm deployed to BitBalloon, right? So I don't have a Node or Express app. As we saw this morning, I can just drag that public folder directly into BitBalloon and deploy this application. Client side versus server side. Yeah, so these are all definitely kind of in the ballpark. I asked that question again to be mindful of, Project 2 was very much server-side driven, right? Server-side rendering. With Angular, particularly this goofy little app, all of the code is delivered to your browser locally when you open up this URL on BitBalloon. All of the logic, all of the data, all of the JavaScript, all the HTML, you already have it locally. So Pedro's right, there is no database wired up. If we did wire up a database, we could probably persist this across machines. But kind of the bigger point I wanted to make is that once we hit refresh, once we load these files, JavaScript and Angular is pretty much running the show locally in our browser. So that's why we're not seeing each other, change the data in the apps that we have rendered on our screen. They're all local now once we download the code. Cool. So let's get to it. We're going to move at quite a clip so we can get you guys to lab time. I put the objectives into Slack. So essentially, we're going to look at some directives like ng repeat. We're going to look at ng if and ng show and hide. Then we're going to build a form with one input field. And then we're going to talk about filters, which is a cool little feature of Angular. Allows you to get really specific with your data. So what are directives? It's pretty much any time you see an ng in your HTML. So directives are markers on an HTML, on a DOM node. You can think custom attributes on HTML tags, like when we add maybe a name tag, a name attribute to an HTML tag, or even like a meta attribute on an HTML tag. These ng Angular directives tell Angular to attach extra behaviors to a node or even transform the node and possibly its children. So Angular comes with a bunch of these built in out of the box, but we can actually create our own. And Thursday, we're going to look at creating some components and some Angular directives to make our code very modular. For example, Jason's app, his project 2, he used cards in his gift registry app. Well, that card idea of cards, of something that's very, very similar, but maybe the data is a little different, that's a perfect use case for a custom directive. And that's something that we're going to look at on Thursday using Angular. It's a really powerful tool. So most of the time we're going to be using ng app, which is a directive. Remember, we put that on our HTML element. ng controller, we've already used that Angular directive. And today we're going to look at a few more. So to get started, we're going to do a little bit of a code along and build an app from scratch. Again, we just want to get some muscle memory with spinning up a Node and Express app and putting Angular on top of it. So I'm going to ask you guys, if you want to follow along with me, let's go ahead and try to knock this thing out in real time. So it's going to be very similar to what we did this morning. And all the code is in the README. I'll also paste this into Slack, where it's pretty helpful to maybe copy some of this code. So let's get started. I'll put kind of the first 4 steps here into Slack. And I can actually copy this server code as well into Slack if you want to grab that. But let's start like we did this morning. We'll create a new directory for our app. I'm going to put my app in instructor examples, so you guys will have kind of a finished version if you want it for reference. Let's go ahead and make dir. We'll just call this to-do app. Then I'll cd into that. And let's do another npm init-y. And then for this app, it's pretty basic as far as npm modules. We're going to install Express and Path. And again, Path is just a really handy npm module that kind of helps Express find our specific pathways. We're going to be creating another public folder, and so installing the npm module Path just helps Express keep those wires straight. So I'm also going to touch a server.js file, and I'll go ahead and open up my project in Atom. And so the code that I just pasted into Slack, we'll put that into server.js. And again, this is pretty much what we did twice this morning. It's just kind of the bare bones code to instantiate a new Node and Express app. So we'll require some modules. We're going to use our path module here. We're going to create one basic root route, which is going to serve one index page. And that index page is going to be the entry point to our Angular application. And then this Node app will be listening on port 4000. So let's create a public directory and get our HTML file going. I'll move this up a little bit. So I'm going to make another dir, and make sure that you're in the project folder at this point. Pretty important. So if I do an ls, I'm kind of in the parent directory here. So let's make another directory for our JavaScript files. I'm just using JS for short today. And inside that one, let's create an app.js file. So here's what our file structure should look like so far. Pretty much the same recipe from this morning. And then while we're here, I'm going to go ahead, just so we have it, and touch a to-dos controller file that we will add our controller info for to-dos in shortly. Like so. Cool. So we've created 2 JavaScript files. Let's go ahead and touch our index.html file while we're here as well. Then inside of that, sorry, I'll paste this into Slack if you're not following along. So these are our steps so far. And then let me put in the specific index code if you want to grab that, if it's a little easier. Cool. So in the interest of time, I didn't want to give you guys too much starter code, but if you want to copy this, it's fine just to get us bootstrapped up and running. So in my index, I have the ng app directive because we're going to create a controller, excuse me, we're going to create an app, angular.module, and we're going to call it to-do app. And then down here, we're going to add our ng controller here shortly. And then I'm going ahead and pulling in the CDN for Angular, and I'm also pulling in my app.js and my to-dos controller because we definitely need our app to know about those files. So at this point, let me run nodemon server.js, and let's make sure that this is wired up correctly. I put some handlebars in here in the body. Again, remember that the Angular handlebars is valid JavaScript. So just as a quick sanity check, I put in 1 + 1. So hopefully I get 3. Right? Anyone? Sorry. I'm just joking, you guys. We should get 2. And we don't. So if I check my console, I have not instantiated my app yet. So we're going to do that here in a few steps. So actually, that's correct. We have not created any, we haven't instantiated a angular.module in our app.js. So that's fine. We'll do that in the next step. One thing about Angular errors I think is kind of interesting is if you go into the JavaScript console in your browser, again, now we're going to be debugging primarily in the browser for the most part because Angular, again, is all front end, right? So now we can go back when we talk about our console logs and such. At this point, you know, we're talking about the browser console log again. Because I know in Unit 2, when we said check your console, we were talking about the server console a lot of the time. But the errors for Angular are kind of interesting. So you can click on an error, and Angular just kind of like plugs in your specific error. It kind of plugs it into this, you know, visualization that's very specific to your machine. So when I click on that error, I'm going to like the Angular source docs, right? And they're giving me an error page for my to-do app. I feel so special. Isn't that amazing? But no, there's really no magic. Angular is just has a way underneath the hood of sending details about my specific error for my specific app to a page like this. So when it renders, it tries to give us a little bit more detail, which I think is kind of cool. It's a little personable, and then it gives you maybe some suggested some suggested places to look to debug. So go ahead and give me a thumbs up in Slack, maybe at that last message when you have completed those steps. Again, you should see handlebars in 1 + 1. We're going to instantiate our Angular module in the next step, but just want to make sure we have kind of the scaffolding for our Node and Express Angular app kind of in broad strokes. All right, got some thumbs up, so that's good. So if you have anything pressing, go ahead and ping Christine. If it's something that is going to take more than like a minute or two, feel free to like ask me a question or raise your hand, or you know, Christine can ping me. But like I said, I want to try to hit these so we can get you to some lab time as quickly as we can. So let's move forward. Let's take a look at a really handy Angular directive called ng-repeat. So this is going to allow us to loop over objects, Angular data objects, if you will. So for this section, let's go into our to-dos. Well, before we do that, I'm going to go into app.js. We actually need to instantiate this. And wouldn't you know it, I did not even put that step in here. Oh, I did. I skipped over it myself. What an idiot. So my bad, you guys. Right here on step 7, actually instantiate the app. I'm so sorry. You guys need to keep me honest here. So I'm going to use my iffy syntax. Again, we just want to be consistent and try to like preemptively stop our app from blowing up or potentially blowing up when we minimize and such. So let's go to Angular module. And the first argument is the actual name of our application. We're going to call this to-do app. And then remember that these square brackets, even if we aren't going to inject any dependencies into our app, those square brackets are still required. And just a reminder, tomorrow we're going to take a look at our first injection using $HTTP for routing. But for now, that's going to be just fine. So I think at this point, just to see our stuff render, now this should equate to 2 in our browser. So if I refresh, so now we should see 2. So that's kind of the bare minimum. We don't even need a controller, an ng controller at a very basic level. As long as we instantiate a new Angular module, new Angular app, and we add that ng app directive to our HTML, and as long as we're pulling in our our Angular CDN and requiring the particular files from our JavaScript folder, that's pretty much the bare minimum we need to get started. Okay, cool. I digress. So back to our ng repeat. Now we're going to go into our to-dos controller, and let's create our controller, and then we're going to hard code some data, some to-dos, just to see something rendered to the screen. All of this code is in the README, but again, I'm going to do this longhand. I would encourage you guys to do the same. So I'm going to create my iffy, kind of my shell there. And the first thing I need to do so we can chain a controller onto our module is I'm just going to declare my module again. So Angular module, the name of our app is to-do app. And then we already declared our app here in app.js, so I don't need to put the square brackets again in like any controller files or services or factories. I only need that when I first instantiate my app, so we're fine with not putting it right here. And to add a controller like we did this morning, I'm just going to add the Angular controller method to instantiate a controller. This takes 2 arguments. So the first argument is the actual name of our controller. If we want to reference this controller throughout our application, whatever the string is that we put as the first argument, that's going to be how we refer to this controller throughout our application. The second argument, as I mentioned this morning, technically we could just like pass in an anonymous function and start building out this controller. That's not really the driest preferred way to do this. Kind of the best practice is to create a separate function to instantiate our controller, maybe a few lines below it. It's just a drier way of doing it. So I'm going to go to-dos controller, and we'll create that down below. Not to mention, if I wanted to add other features, like if I wanted to add other modules or services here, if I could spell today, it's just easier to chain these together when we kind of set it up this way, which is another really good reason to do it. So we can do all the chaining here at the top, and then we can declare the specific functions we're going to use underneath it. It's just a nice pattern to use. I need to put my semicolon there. And let's go ahead and declare our to-dos controller like so. And I'll open that up. And so this is where we're going to put all of our business logic for our to-dos controller. And for this step, we're pretty much just going to pop in some to-dos. So as long as you kind of manually type out that information, it's all good if you want to copy this to-dos array that I'm going to put into Slack here. So you guys can just copy this. Just some hard-coded to-dos. And again, all this controller is just a fancy Angular constructor function. And as such, we can use this keyword to attach things to the global scope, i.e. we can use the this keyword to attach stuff to our view, to actually render it on our index.html page. So for this one, I'm just going to attach a property of all, and all is going to equal an array of 5 to-dos. So if you want to add some more to-dos, that's totally cool, but just some random to-dos. They all are currently not done, which is not great, but we'll get to that. Cool, so that's our to-dos controller. So what is the next step if you want to come on mic or if you want to put it into Slack? So the controller looks good. What would be some of the processes we need to go through to get this into our index.html? What are some of the first steps we need to do to wire this thing up?
We need to add an ng controller.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, we definitely need to do that. I've already put in the script to bring in the file. That would just be, kind of the first thing we do. But yeah, let's add our ng controller directive. A very, very popular one. And then what is this ng controller going to look like? And someone can put it into Slack or come online. What should this directive equal?
It would be to-dos controller as to-do.
Yeah, nice. So we're going to call this to-dos just because that's kind of the, kind of the preferred syntax. You want to make it, maybe what you call the controller, something like that. But could this word to-dos, does this have to be to-dos, or could this be like unicorn or whatever I wanted this alias to be?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a really janky question. My sincere apologies. The answer is yes. So the to-dos controller needs to be specific because that's the actual name of the controller that we're declaring right here on line 3. So that string needs to be the exact syntax. But this as, we could make that whatever we wanted. It's just an alias. This would work if you called it unicorn. In fact, I encourage you to do so at some point, but the convention would be to call it to-dos. Cool, so let's refresh our browser. We should not see anything yet because we're still not wired up with our data. So can someone walk me through or give me some suggestions on how we could start getting that array of data of to-dos into our view? Just baby steps before we even start looping over it. How could I just get that garbage into my view?
To-dos.all.
Yeah, that'd be a good first step. Yeah, let's check it out. Cool. Yes, this is a great first step. I'm not, just really small baby steps, which is something I think we would try to encourage you guys for all of your projects, just one small thing at a time. So yeah, that's great. So at least we've wired up the data from our controller to our view, which is awesome. Let's flesh this out a little bit though. So to make this look like the sample app, let's put a header in here. This isn't mission critical, but I'll call this our Angular to-do app. And then we were also keeping count of how many to-dos we have. So I'll put that. So I have empty handlebars to-dos. So how would we get how many items are in an array using JavaScript? How could we do that? It's just JavaScript.
Dot length.
Yeah, exactly. So let's put a to-dos.all right there. And if we refresh, cool. So we have kind of a basic structure going. So right now we're counting the to-dos and we can see our janky array of to-dos right there. Awesome. So let's work on that ng repeat directive, and let's start looping over that array and printing out some to-dos in a more orderly fashion. And this is what it's going to look like for the most part. So I'll do this right underneath here. For this example, we're just going to create a UL, an unordered list, and then we'll put some LIs in there. We'll create new LIs for each item. So for this one, I'll create a UL. It's not letting me do that. I'll just go underneath it and close it off. Yeah, so we'll create our UL. And then clean that up a little bit. Now, in the code example I put an ID on here. This isn't essential because we're not really, there's no CSS for this app or anything. So this ID is just kind of like syntactic sugar, if you will, if we were going to add any kind of rules or something later. Or if we were going to refer to this in some sort of JavaScript manner, we would maybe want to put an ID on it, but that's not really crucial to this lesson. But we will need to create LIs for each to-do. And this should be very similar to our #each using handlebars. So let's use an ng repeat directive. It's a very popular Angular directive. And for this one, we're going to declare kind of an alias for kind of the placeholder for what we want each item within our object or collection or array to be represented by. So again, the convention would be, since we're iterating over a list of to-dos, it makes sense that I would want each one to be called a singular to-do. So for each to-do in todos.all, and then let me close off my li here underneath it. So to keep it simple, I'm just going to grab the to-do, the task. So each to-do has a task property and a done property. We can see that right here. I just want to print out the task for now, just to make sure this is working. So we're going to loop over each to-do and to-dos. Let's see what that looks like in our browser. Cool. So far so good. Just have an unordered list, and it's creating a new LI for each to-do. And this should be somewhat, I hope this is pretty familiar from our handlebars project 2 coverage there. Cool, and here's just a little bit of an explanation about what we just did. Just to recap. And hit me up in Slack if anything's getting out of sorts. Eric noticed he did an OL and it only had 1 as the list number. Eric, you mean it listed like 11111, or it only listed 1 to do? Did 11111? Yeah, so you may want to look at, I actually put it into the lab. Sometimes ng repeat has trouble with like indexing and such. So you may want to use something called $index. Well, let's come back to that because I did put it in the lab because you may want to use it. That may be a reason for why that ordered list is doing that. Angular may just may not be very smart about creating an ordered list, but. So to recap, our ng repeat, which you guys are going to use pretty frequently, it's kind of like a fancy for loop for Angular. So, we decided that we're going to use the keyword to do kind of as like our iterative for each item in to-dos. We're going to call it a to-do, and then we can call the given properties for to-do, to-do.task, to-do.done if we wanted. But pretty straightforward with the ng repeat. So ng repeat, again, it's a built-in directive that Angular provides for us. And pretty much anytime you see an ng dash in Angular, you can rest assured that it is some sort of directive. And again, directives are kind of like fancy pants attributes that we put on HTML tags. So any questions about ng repeat? Did anyone's app completely blow up? Just ping me if it is.
Yeah, I did mine, and it started spitting money out of my computer.
That's pretty awesome. I would pick a safe word and call a loved one at that point. It's like Pedro is crying. I wish this thing spit out money. It'd be pretty sweet. All right, so moving right along, we have our list working. Now let's actually add some functionality or some interactivity to it. Let's add a very simple form, and let's see how we can bind our data to our controller. So let's see how data binding works by adding items to our list, and we're going to need a form for that. I'm going to put the form, I'll just put it at the bottom underneath our UL, and the form is nothing fancy. Angular does have some form-specific directives. If you want to check out the documentation, we're not really going to worry about those right now. We're just going to use a pretty simple HTML form for this. Again, just because it's in the lesson, I'll put this ID on here. So if you wanted to go back and add CSS later, you'd have that ID available to you. We're also going to use this for when we actually add the click events and such. So in this case, the add to do is going to be, it's going to have a specific purpose here in a few steps. Inside that, let's add an input box. So for this one, we want a text box. The name doesn't matter because we're dealing with Angular, and Angular has its own directives that we're going to use to bind the data to the back end. Excuse me, not the back end, but to the Angular controller. But we can put a placeholder in here if we want, just to be polite. I need to add something. So we'll do that. Cool. So let's refresh, make sure that that is rendering. Okay, cool. So we have that there. It's not doing anything. It's just a janky little input box. But let's add some more features to that. So on the controller side, how would we write a function that adds a new item to our array? So you guys are pretty savvy about this stuff because you had to do some of this for Project 2. So it's not that dissimilar to do it in an Angular-esque way. One way that we could do this, if we go to our to-dos controller, and this example is in the README, we may want to do something that looks like this. So inside our to-dos controller, maybe we want to do like a var add to-do function. If we were going to like pseudocode this out. So we know that we want to add a to-do, but what would that to-do look like? So this is similar to what we did in the last unit. So this .all is just an array. So we know that we would want to add the contents of that form. We just want to push it onto this array. And we'll do this kind of like a step at a time. So right now we're hard coding this function, so it's not very dynamic yet, but this is a good kind of hard coded object just to confirm that we can get this thing wired up correctly. So right now this function, all it's going to do is push this exact object onto the array every time. We're not going to be able to like change it or anything. But at least we can see if we can get the data binding working and see if when we actually like click on that input field or hit enter, let's see if it'll actually add something, if it'll update our DOM, update that array. So now that we've hard-coded this object, let's go back to our index.html. And now what we can do, we'll need to go back to our controller for one more step. But now we can use an Angular directive called ng-submit. And this ng-submit is going to equal the specific method or function that we put into our to-dos controller. So remember that this to-dos controller is still governing, it's governing everything on our body. So we can still communicate with our to-dos controller with this to-dos alias. So for this one, we're going to grab the to-dos add method. So we still need to go back to controller and add that. So we're going to do that right now. I'm also going to split my screen. Maybe this will be a little better. So we can see both of these at once. So here's our form, here in our index, and then here's our to-dos controller. So we got the function defined right here. But now we actually need to do something with it. And the way that we can do that is using our this keyword again. And for this one, I'm just going to call this add. And this add property is going to equal our add to do function up here on line 14.
Hey, Mark, is there a reason that you can't, where you declare your add to do, why can't you just do this dot add to do equals function?
It won't work.
It won't work.
I knew you were going to ask that. This will not work. That just won't work. Yeah, so that's why we're having to do it in 2 steps. That's why we're having to declare the function and then like attach it to this separately. Yeah, this just won't work for some reason with Angular. It doesn't like it. Even that doesn't like that either. So yeah. So we'll declare the variable here and assign an anonymous function to it, and then we'll attach it to our this object separately. So let's save that, and let's see what happens now. So I'm going to refresh my browser. So it's still not getting any input from the form, right? It's just that every time we hit enter, it's going to keep adding this janky hard-coded task. But at least we know that it's working. At least we know that it's binding somehow. So that's really cool. So we've got kind of the first step working. So try that out and make sure that you can type. Actually, I don't even think you have to type anything in here. You can just hit enter and see if you're able to update the DOM appropriately. And again, just as a reminder, as soon as we refresh our browser, all of that data is going to be, it's going to start over. It's going to hit our controller and get that fresh array of 5 to-dos. But at least that's working appropriately. Oh, one more thing while we're here, just for funsies. I think it's really interesting that Angular, not only are we walking through specific ng directives and such, but Angular is also doing a lot of magic underneath the hood that I find is pretty interesting. So if you inspect the element for our form or for our to-do list or anything down here, Angular is adding extra directives and extra stuff underneath the hood so that Angular can manage our DOM for us. It's pretty interesting, I think. So for example, here on the body, it's also adding a class of ng scope, which is an Angular directive. We get that for free. Angular does that for us, and that's one way that it can kind of track and maintain the scope of our application. Some other things that it's doing, take a look here at our H3. Angular is also adding a class of ng binding. So right here, we're keeping track. We added some handlebars, and we're doing todos.all.length. And so Angular needs to know, hey, I need to keep an eye out on this DOM element. I need to listen for changes in the updates in the data. Because it's not like we're clicking on this thing to update it. You know, it's not like we have a button to update how many to-dos we have, right? The amount of to-dos we have, it's data-driven. So this number increases or decreases based on the data for the to-dos we have in our array, which is pretty interesting. So one way that Angular keeps track of that under the hood is with these invisible kind of underneath the hood directives. This one's really fun, I think, right here on our form. This is always fun. So here's a class of ng pristine and ng valid. So if we were going to add validations to our forms and such, making sure passwords are a specific length or have particular characters, this ng valid would come into play. But there's also ng pristine, which is really interesting. If we have a lot of form fields, it tells Angular which fields have been clicked into, first of all, have had focus on them. And it also keeps track using something called ng dirty, which we'll see here shortly. It also keeps track if that field has actually had some sort of activity on it. So let me show you what I mean. Just for example, if I click inside this form and then I start typing, and we haven't hooked up our ng model. Okay, hold that thought. We'll see that in action in a minute. Because right now we're still like not getting input from the form. Well, when you click enter, you can kind of see it. We'll see some more in a second. But see how it says ng submitted because I hit enter? So that's kind of cool. But we'll come back and check this out in a second once we actually like wire up the form to here. But there's a lot of fun stuff going on under the hood if you're interested in checking it out. And also our ng repeats. Notice that it's putting an ng binding and then an ng scope. So ng scope refers to like which controller is managing the situation, and also the binding, you know, because the ng repeats depend on how many items are in the array and such. Anywho, I digress. That's just kind of like extra stuff I think's kind of fun about Angular. Anyway, where were we? So we have the form. We're able to add stuff to the list, but we're still not adding the specific info from our form to the list. So we're going to do that with another Angular directive called ng-model. And you guys probably went through this in code school. I'm pretty certain that you did. Did you guys go over ng-model in code school? Did you get that far? Yeah, it's a pretty, you know, pretty common directive in Angular. So obviously we don't want to use any dummy data. So how do we keep an eye on what's in the input field and send that information specifically to our add to do function in our controller? So we're going to do this with the ng-model directive. And I'll put this into Slack. So essentially we're hard coding this janky task object that's hard coded with something and with done of false. So this next step should be similar to when we would do like request.body and then the name of the field from the form that we were gathering information from. Hopefully this should be pretty familiar thematically to what we did in Unit 2. So let's make a new to-do object in our object controller, or in our to-dos controller, but let's make it match that form. So the first thing we're going to do here, before I do that, I'm going to create a new to-do outside. And this will be kind of our model for what we want a new to-do to look like. So right now I'm going to instantiate it just with an empty string, and then done by default is going to be false. So that's kind of our boilerplate for a new to-do. So now in our index.html, now let's put that ng-model directive on our form and try to wire these two things up. So right here on our input field, the actual field that we want to connect to our controller, let me put my ng-model directive on there. And we're still within the to-dos controller, kind of ng controller scope. So we're going to do to-dos dot new task, or new to-do rather, because we're going to attach this model to this new to-do that we're defining inside of our controller. And then specifically, this field is going to be adding the specific task to that new to-do that we created in the controller. So this is going to be for task. So in project 2, we probably would have like created a name for this field and made that name equal task, right? So we could send that back like request.body.task. We could get the contents of that field. Angular uses this directive called ng-model. So that's how we're going to pass data from a form to our controller. So now that we have that working, just as an intermediary step, I'll put this into Slack too, just to check out that kind of real-time data binding. Before we even send it to the controller, I'm going to put a p tag underneath here, and so we can see what we're typing into the field in real time. So about to add to do to list. And then here, let's put in handlebars the lesson I put in strong tags, which are kind of optional if you want to use those. But in here, let's grab the binding for that ng-model. So I just want to see the contents of todos.newTodo.task as it pertains to what I'm putting into this ng-model. So just as kind of an intermediary step. So let's see if this is wired up correctly. About to add to do, that doesn't even make sense English-wise, huh? Okay, so let's refresh. And so now let's see, drink some beer. So yeah, so it looks like at least the data model, as far as the view is concerned, that it's wired up correctly. So at least we can grab the input from this input box, from this text input, and we're able to see it render onto the DOM, which is pretty cool. But now let's like wire it up to the back end. Let's actually wire it up and add it to our to-dos array. So the last piece of the puzzle here, let's go back into our add to-do function inside our controller. And again, hopefully this is very similar to what we would have done in Unit 2, which would have been something like, request.body task. That would have been somewhat how we would have done it with the express. But for this one, we're going to do a this new to-do dot task. So we have two-way data binding here. We can send information from the browser to the controller, and then we can also send information from the controller to the browser. So it's a two-way street. And this all happens in real time. We don't have to go back to the server like we did in Unit 2. All this is happening within the browser, and it's super, super fast. We'll keep the done kind of set defaults for default. And then a nice little polite thing we'll do right here. We'll just clear out the form after we submit this data. So this should be similar to what some of the strategy some of you guys used for Project 2 is once I submit the data, go ahead and set the contents of that field. Just reset it by using an empty string. And that'll kind of reset our input box. Okay, I think this looks pretty good. Let's make sure this is working. Actually, I don't think we need this anymore. Let's just confirm that. So we'll refresh, drink some beer, and then we hit enter. Yeah, so now we're actually able to append information to the DOM, to the view. So it's updating that array. And if we go down here, again, I just think these are fun. Some of the stuff that Angular is adding, some of this extra syntactic sugar, if you will. So right now, our form, for example, is ng pristine and ng valid. Once I get into here and I start typing, now now Angular tracks it as ng dirty, meaning there has been some activity within the form field. And sometimes that's a really important thing to keep track of. I mean, maybe you want to know if a user has accessed that field, maybe they changed their mind about something. There's a lot of extra stuff that Angular does that we may or may not want to use. So yeah, cool. So our stuff should be updating by now. And then we can add it to our DOM right there. So let's pause right there for a moment and see if you guys have any questions or if you need anything to get up to speed to this point. I'll push this code up as well so you guys will have access to it. But any questions at this point?
Yeah, I'm a little bit behind, Mark, if you don't mind me like sharing screen with you and asking a question.
Sure. Yeah, let's take a minute or two to get you up to speed.
Sure.
Then we have, just want to go over ng-if directives and then Angular filter and then put you guys in our breakouts for lab time. So we're super close to lab. But yeah, go ahead, Richie. Let me stop my screen share.
Sure. I just have this displaying as this, as opposed to like actually showing the to-dos I have in the controller.
Let's see. Okay, so I just think that our Angular is not wired up correctly. So the first thing I want you to do is go into the browser and check your console. So that's the first stop. We're going to check and see if there's any errors. And you do have some. So to-dos controller not defined. Okay. Do you have any others if you scroll up or down?
No, that's it.
Okay. So I am going to take a stab that this is a syntax issue. So let's just confirm. Let's check each file really quickly. Let's go to your index.html. So on line 2, you're instantiating the app, to-do app with a lowercase t. Okay. Your to-dos controller file is called to-dos controller. That looks good. Okay. This looks... Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's check out your to-dos. Well, let's check out your app.js first. Sorry, let's just make sure that we're instantiating. Okay, that looks good. And then your to-dos controller. To-do app, touching controller, to-dos controller. Okay. Go back to your index.html. On line 10, you have a capital T to-dos controller, and I think you had a lowercase t in your to-dos controller file. You may want to check my math on that. I think you had it lowercase in the other file.
You can check it. Let me see.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, so just that's a really good thing to point out. So remember that, like, and I think this was indicative of Project 2. You know, a lot of you guys is, you know, errors. It wasn't necessarily logic. It wasn't necessarily like understanding the big picture. A lot of it was, you know, syntax, and that's a pretty common thing, but just something to kind of like be aware of. That attention to detail is really important. Something that helps that out is using linters, which I think we'll talk about that, you know, maybe for Project 3 and maybe even going forward. You know, Atom has a lot of good linters, and it'll kind of immediately point out errors and syntactic things that it finds that are a little wonky. I think sometimes errors can be overkill. Like sometimes it'll point out errors that really aren't errors. And you can tailor your linters. You can tell it to make exceptions and stuff. You can kind of customize it. But linters are really good, way to alleviate that stuff. Another really quick aside is Angular 2 actually uses a form of JavaScript called TypeScript. Has anyone heard of TypeScript before? Anything like that? Jason, Tom? Okay. So yeah, so TypeScript is a strongly typed kind of, you know, branch off of JavaScript. But what it's really good for is debugging. So TypeScript is really good at letting you know kind of errors, and it really barks at you in real time. It's kind of like a self-lintering language kind of version of JavaScript. And I know it's really popular for Angular 2 right now because Angular 2 is pretty intricate. And it's a really good way to make sure that you're checking your stuff in real time. So just something to think about. Okay, any other questions? We're going to move through these 2 other sections and then get you guys to lab time. All right, let's do it. So let's talk about ngIf, which is another Angular directive. This is kind of a really common built-in one. ngIf, ngShow, ngHide. So ngIf, we're going to play around with that little portion of our HTML that shows you're about to add this to-do to your list, just to see an example of this. So let's say, for example, that we think that paragraph that says about to add to-do, blah, 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 should only be seen or should only show when new to-do isn't empty. So i.e., we don't really want to see that paragraph tag unless we've actually started typing in a to-do, just for an example. So the way that we can do that, ngIf is kind of a Boolean type of directive, right? So it's either true or false. So if we go back to our index.html, I'll share my screen. My sincere apologies. There we go. Cool. If we go down to our p tag, so we already know that we're binding the contents of that input field using ng model. We already have access to the contents of that with this todos.newTodo.task, which is pretty sweet. So if we want to make this a little bit more dynamic, on this p tag, let's add an ngIf directive. And again, ngIf is a Boolean type of directive. So it's essentially going to be like, does todos.newTodo.task exist? Is this truthy or falsy? So if we've typed into that input box, we want this to show. If the input box is empty, then don't even show me that garbage. So let me refresh. Let's make sure this is working. So when I first refresh, we don't see that little helper p tag, you're about to add this to do. But as soon as I go into here and start typing, it renders. So that's a nice little directive, nice little kind of feature of Angular that you have at your disposal. In the lesson, there's a differentiation between, let's say, ngIf and ngHide. So ngHide and ngShow, it's very similar to the jQuery hide and show methods. So all it does is affect the CSS property of display. It changes it, let's say, from none to display block, something like that. ngIf, literally, that element does not exist within the DOM unless it's truthy. So it's a little bit more of a dynamic type of Angular directive. And let me just quickly show you an example like what I'm talking about. So if I refresh right here, and I look in my DOM, so notice that within my DOM, right here in the inspect element, that p tag doesn't even exist. I don't even see it in here. But as soon as I start typing, if you watch down here in my inspect element, Angular will attach that p tag to my DOM node. It'll create a DOM node for that element. So if I start typing in here, now that this is truthy, now Angular decides to attach it to the DOM. So that's what ngIf does. Now ngShow and ngHide, let me just change this to an ngHide just to, for what it's worth, just to kind of show you the difference. So let's change this from an if to a, actually maybe a show, because we want this to show if this is truthy. So let me refresh. So when we use ngShow and ngHide, they're kind of, sister and brother directives. So again, when I refresh the page, that p tag is not rendered in the browser. However, it does exist, in the DOM tree, right? So I can see the node right here. And if I click on it, notice that Angular is changing the CSS to display none. So it's just affecting the CSS property. And then as soon as I start typing with this, now that display none disappears, and now it actually renders into the DOM. So it's just a really small thing, just wanted to point out. ngIf is a little more substantial. It literally like removes stuff from the DOM, and ngHide and ngShow just affects that CSS display property for what it's worth. And you guys will get to play with ngIf in the lab time for sure. Okay, and last but not least, kind of a fun feature of Angular are Angular filters. So let's take a quick test drive of these. There's a lot of these if you go through the documentation. We're just going to take a look at a couple. So Angular filters format a value from within the view, and it's just for presentation purposes only, which is really kind of an important concept. Angular filters don't affect the underlying data itself. It doesn't like ping the database. It doesn't, overwrite anything. It's strictly kind of in the DOM. It just renders, it just alters how the data is presented. So keep that in mind. And let's take a look at some of these examples. So let's say that in my HTML, let's say for this to-do.task, let's say that I wanted each task to render as all uppercase. Let's say that I wanted to do that. So the way that you can add Angular filters is within the handlebars of the specific element that you're trying to manipulate with the filter. You put a pipe, and then you add the specific Angular criteria filter that you want to add. So in this case, I just want to make every to-do.task uppercase. So I'll save that and refresh. And now I've got my to-dos barking at me. You need to get this done, dude. So that's a really quick way to add a filter in Angular. Let's say that I wanted to limit, maybe for a password or an email field or something. Let's say that I wanted to limit the number of characters that you could put into a field, or that I wanted to render to a field or something. So for this one, you could use, for example, these are just some examples, limit to. And let's say that I wanted each to-do to only be limited to 8 characters for space reasons, or maybe I wanted to add a feature where I can only see 8 characters, just like a snapshot, And then if I click on it, maybe I see more information or something, maybe for a news article or something. So I can go back here and refresh. Cool. And now I've told Angular to only show me the 8 characters for each to do. And you can chain these together too. So if I had a pipe in an uppercase, I should be able to see both. Yeah. So you can chain these together within reason. This is a really good one, currency. So we're not using, dollars and cents here in this example, but you can also use this currency. So maybe if you want it, to render with a couple of decimal points or no decimal points, or you want the $ in front of it, or even some other foreign currency, Angular has options for formatting money, which is pretty interesting. And then right here, number 4, even formatting dates, phone numbers, there's some filters. So you can format dates very specifically, however you want it. If you want the timestamp with the date, or just the day of the week, or what have you, Angular has a lot of flexible filters for that. And then finally, this last one, and again, these are just examples. There's a ton of these on Angular's website or in their documentation. But to-do.task, actually, I don't want it on here. Let's say that I want to sort the to-dos like in descending order. So the way that I could do that, I would actually want to put that on this ng repeat, because I want to affect the entire array of to-dos, right? Not just an individual one. But let's say that I wanted to list all the to-dos in descending order. For example, one way to do that could be using order by. And then this is really interesting. I can do a negative task. So in descending order, list my tasks by putting a negative right here. So this should be descending alphabetical order. Let's check it out. So if I refresh, and there we go. So I have take a nap, tackle, P, G, and B. So descending. If I wanted to go ascending, just get rid of that, minus sign there. And if I refresh, now I have an ascending order. So sometimes that's a cool little trick. A very painless way to sort stuff is just by using these filters. So those are just a few examples. That's by no means exhaustive, but just some examples. Let me pop some final questions in here, and we'll get you guys to lap time. But before we walk through these, do you guys have any? Let me stop my screen share. We were kind of moving at a quick clip this afternoon. I'll push all this code up to GitHub. Any questions come to mind as far as what we've covered? So far we looked at some Angular built-in directives. We'll look at creating our own directives on Thursday, which is really pretty cool and powerful. So built-in directives, we looked at how to play with forms in Angular, and then we looked at some filters. And we also looked at ng model, which is a directive, how we can link up, we can bind data from the view to our controller and vice versa. Any questions?
Yeah, will you show again how you do the bit balloon? Because I tried to do it, but it just still trying to upload for the last 20 minutes.
Oh yeah? Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Let me, I really quickly. So what you want to do, you want to go to bitballoon. Again, this is really janky. You're not going to want to you're not going to deploy your project through on bitballoon for sure, because we'll have a database and other stuff. But yeah, so the gist is that your Node and Express app, it's merely serving up the contents of this public folder. That's all that it's doing. So if you wanted to serve it up, let me pull my, see if I can find where I'm working on my application. So yeah, I'll put up the link, but I was building my application in my instructor's example folder right here. So what I would do is I literally just grab this public folder and drag it into my new site. And I'm able to do this because I'm using the Angular CDN. I could download the Angular source code if I wanted and plug it into my app, but for this one I didn't do that. But yeah, I just dragged the public folder because when you deploy to bitballoon, it takes a folder and then it looks for a file called index.html. So that's pretty important. And so that's literally the only HTML file we have in our public folder is that index. And so if I click on my link, There we go.
Sharing your screen.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You guys got to call me out on that. Cool. My bad. So what I was saying is, I'll do it one more time. So if you go to BitBalloon, really all BitBalloon cares about is that you have an index.html file. And luckily, in our public folder, for the purposes of everything we've done today, the only file we need is one index.html because we're using Angular to handle all of the DOM manipulation, all of the data, all of the view logic and such. So what I was saying is, so here's my app that I'm doing in my instructor examples folder. All you need to do is grab this public folder and drop it into BitBalloon. BitBalloon may bark at me for deploying this POS 3 times, but whatever. Yeah, so if you go to Wrestler Robert 63628, so here's my app that I can add new stuff to.
Okay, I was doing the same thing, but mine just keeps like on the blinking mode. But I don't know, it might be because I don't know. I have a block or something.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to take a peek in a minute once we get started on lab. That sound cool?
Okay. Yes.
So really quickly, just had 3 questions that I put here into Slack. So just kind of a review. How did we add a function to our controller? Today in our example, we had that add to-dos function. How did we add that? So Aaron alluded to that. We weren't able to declare a function. What were like the 2 steps we needed to do in our controller?
First, place it in a variable.
Yeah. Yeah, so unfortunately, sorry, go ahead.
And then link it, just that, yeah.
Yeah, then just assign it to this dot some other variable. Yeah, just the way that Angular works, it doesn't like it when we try to attach this to a function directly. So that's what we did. I just put it into Slack. So we declared that add to do function. Then we did this dot add and then equals add to do. So yeah, it's just kind of a 2-step. I personally, I think that's kind of a good pattern actually. I just think it's a little more dry, separation of concerns. Cool. So something to be mindful of. Number 2, how did we iterate over an array of items? Kind of in broad strokes, what did we use Angular-wise? Yeah, so we use the ng repeat directive. So that's a really handy directive to have. So you iterate something, some collection that's attached to your controller. And then very similar to the #each in handlebars, you just tell Angular the item that you want to loop over, and then you can call the properties and methods of that item. So that should be pretty similar to what we did in Project 2. Just using ng repeat would be the Angular-esque way to do it. And then finally, how did we submit a form? So what were the broad strokes for submitting a form? We went through a pretty bare example today, but what was the directive we used to submit a form using Angular?
ng submit?
Yeah, ng submit was the directive. And how did we link up the data for that form to our controller? What was the directive we used for that, which is a really handy, important one for Angular? So in Project 2, we could attach stuff to request.body and such. But how do we do it in Angular? Sorry, I think I was talking over you.
ng model?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, ng model. So that's what binds data from the view to the controller and vice versa. It's that 2-way data binding. And that's a really crucial, cool thing about Angular, because up to this point, the only way we could update data in our view was to have the server send stuff to us. And now with Angular, we're able to do it this 2-way data binding. For example, when you go to, if you're on Google, your Gmail, do you have to ask for new mail? Gmail just pushes that to you, right? Or if you're on your Facebook news feed, when Schmitty changes a diaper and pushes that that post, it just shows up on your news feed. So there's some other stuff going on underneath, but that idea that it's a more dynamic way of updating that user experience, updating the DOM and such. So In any event, let's get to lab time and have you guys practice some of this cool Angular magic. I'm going to Slack out our lab, and then let me share my screen and just kind of show you guys the app you're going to build. I'll also put it into Slack as well. So I deployed this app so you can take a look at it, that athlete Amanda bit balloon. So if you want to check that out, and I'll share my screen, we'll walk through it. So this app is called Happy App, and the idea is to add some Angular functionality that allows you to tell the app kind of how you're feeling in your mood. So how's your happiness today? We have happy and kind of like comme ci, comme ça, and then sad. So I'm feeling happy right now. So you can click on the happy face and notice that it's kind of highlighted. I'm going to give you all the CSS for this, by the way. So you make a selection on how you're feeling, and then you click Save My Happiness, and then essentially it just pushes your happiness ranking onto this array. Pretty much the same principle we did with to-dos. This circle with the index number, I'm going to give you that. So that's some CSS like pseudo properties. But yeah, the idea is that you can just kind of add your different forms of happiness. A little bit of a pro tip. Since all of this code is now in the browser, it's all client side. If you get stuck or if you need a hint, you can go into the inspect element and kind of get an idea of what's going on under the hood. I will push all the solution code later this afternoon, but if you get stuck, you can literally see the files. I'll just show you because I'm a nice person. You can go into sources. And again, unlike Project 2, now all of this stuff is client-side. So you can see the HTML. Obviously, this is all the solution code because it's deployed. Here's the controller file and all the goodies in there. I want you guys to build out the controller file, but anyway, this is what I want you guys to work on. It doesn't have to look exactly like this, but that's the idea. So let's go to the lab instructions here. So the mission is to build a tiny little Angular application together that tracks happiness so you can keep a log of how you feel each day. And just like this morning's stuff, I put in the steps to create this from scratch. So again, this will be the 4th app that you guys create today just to get some practice and some muscle memory. And here are all the instructions. So we'll build this with a basic Node and Express backend. And then here is how to instantiate your Angular app with Angular app module. Here are the kind of the broad strokes of a ratings controller. So this will be the only controller you need to build. But I even kind of gave you the broad strokes here. So ratings controller, and then you will need to create a function, an add rating function. And so that's right here as well. Here's the HTML to get you started, and all the links to link up the files and the Angular CDNs right here. Here's the steps to NG, you guys get it. And then actually for the HTML, what I actually did is I gave you all the HTML. All you have to do is complete the Angular directives. So for example, right here on the section tag, you can see that there's an ng controller directive, but it's empty. So all you need to do is fill in the appropriate code for that. Here's some ng if statements. Here's an ng repeat. So I tried to make this kind of as just all you need to do is focus on kind of the Angular directives. Here's some ng model directives. You just need to like fill in the blanks there. And then here's some CSS if you want to create a CSS file folder with the style.css. Here's some code to pretty up your app. Here's what your file structure should look like. And yeah, just want you to kind of mimic that athlete Amanda bit balloon link where you can add your mood. And then you may or may not need this. The solution I did use this, but for ng repeat, you may want to check out this track by index. Totally space and Eric. So earlier you were saying that your ordered list was just doing like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a look at that, but my just first thought was maybe we need to do like a track by index on that. Although it may be
That's probably
something,
what it is.
it may be something even simpler than that, because I can't imagine Angular would like blow up on like an ordered list. I would hope that the good people at Google would have thought that one through, and maybe that's how they tackle it. But you may want to take a look at that track by index. So yeah, so that's our lab time for today. Again, just want you guys to worry about building this app, following the instructions. And then once you do get it built, all you need to do is fill in the directives. So just want you guys to kind of focus on the Angular portion of the app. So let me stop my screen share. And any questions about lab time? Let me create some quick breakout rooms for you guys, and we'll get started.